Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly Shanti in Place gathering. Thank you so much for joining us today. A couple of quick notes before we dive into our practice and our discussion. First is, we have started streaming on YouTube Live, and we're hoping to make recordings available on YouTube as well. So just wanted to let everyone know that or remind everyone about that. You're welcome to keep your cameras on or off. We do ask that, of course, you keep your microphone muted during the practice, but as you feel comfortable, you can keep your camera on or off for a part or all of our practice and gathering today. A second note is that we, believe it or not, have been gathering together every week now for almost 3 months. So we started, I think, if memory serves me correctly, right at the sort of the tail end of March, beginning of April. And so we've been gathering throughout April, throughout May, and now rounding out June. In July, we are going to go on a brief hiatus. So what that means is the Shanti in Place gathering, along with other offerings from the Hindu Life program, will kind of go on break. And we will resume in August. So we're looking to resume in August. I don't remember the exact date, but I believe our next session in August, or rather, we have one more session next week. So that will be our final session just at the end of, to mark the end of June. And then after that, we will commence again in August. I believe it's August 2nd or 3rd that we'll gather. So I'll say this again next week, but this is the penultimate. And next week will be the last session before we go on break for July. So with that, let's begin our practice. And I want to invite everyone, if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and take a comfortable seat, whatever that means for you. We often discuss how that means different things to different people. So whatever it means for you anatomically, emotionally, situationally, whether you're sitting on the ground, I like to sit on the ground. If you're sitting on the ground, maybe just take this opportunity to feel yourself a little bit more grounded, making contact perhaps with the sit bones and your pillow or mat or the floor, the ground itself. If you're sitting in a chair, that's absolutely fine as well. But perhaps take a moment to, with more intention and awareness, to connect the soles of your feet or your shoes to the ground below you. And just take that moment to situate yourself to be more grounded, more present. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and close your eyes if you're comfortable doing so, or soften your gaze, perhaps finding an object, a physical object or a physical point in space to focus your softened gaze on. Easing more intentionally now into that space of practice. Beginning our practice perhaps with 3 deep breaths, inhaling in with intention and releasing on the out breath, letting go of any expectations, any tension that you may be holding, anything which may prevent you from being present in this moment. Taking a nice deep breath in and out. Breathing in again, then letting go. One final deep breath in and out. Now allowing your breath to find its natural rhythm, its natural flow. There's no need to control or manipulate the breath to adjust or change anything you're doing. Simply allow the breath to find its own pace, its own rhythm. When we allow the breath to settle, we allow the mind to settle. We offer the breath as a resting place for the mind. Our minds, our reactive minds, are so busy, so active, perhaps even so anxious, always looking for a place to land, always jumping from one thought to another, from one moment to another. Jumping into the past, jumping forward into the future. But with kindness, let us offer this moment, this breath, for our minds to simply rest. Continuing to notice the breath, allowing our awareness to rest on the body itself, to notice the body, its sensations, its feelings. No need to change anything, just noticing the body as it is, as it presents itself in this moment, exactly as it should be. Noticing any area in the outer or inner organs of the body that might be holding tension, that might be crying for some attention, some softening. With intention, giving ourselves permission here to adjust if we need to slightly adjust anything, to once again find that comfortable seat. And giving ourselves permission to simply notice that which we can't adjust, without judgment, simply noticing that tension, accepting it for what it is, and remaining present to this moment. Letting the breath guide us back to this moment if we feel we've strayed from it. Allowing the breath now to guide us a little bit more deeply inward. Allowing our awareness to rest within. Allowing ourselves perhaps a moment here to experience the appreciation, the recognition, the wonder that we are observers, that this moment is a gift in which all I have to do, all I am called to do is simply notice, simply observe. Noticing now any residual desire to control, to manipulate, to judge this moment, and with intention, letting go, releasing ourselves of anything that binds us to our expectations, to our desire to control. Perhaps audibly sighing out in our exhale. Recognizing in these final moments of our practice together, perhaps a feeling of lightness, of relief, of freedom, of allowing ourselves to simply be, and perhaps aspiring to take some of that feeling out with us into our day, into our world, into our life. Bringing our practice to a close now with one final deep breath in with intention, breathing out the sacred sound, the primeval, primordial vibration of Om. And you're welcome to chant along if you feel comfortable doing so, or simply be present and open to the vibration of the sound. Taking a deep breath in together. Gently and with ease, softly opening our eyes or widening our gaze, returning our attention and our awareness to our gathering together. It's wonderful to see you all here and to share this precious time with you. I hope everyone can see my screen. So today we're going to be reflecting on the idea of balance. It's one of the most important concepts in meditation practice and in classical yoga practice. And if we think about it, practically speaking, in everything, in every endeavor, particularly when we want to approach our endeavors with intention and we want to act in such a way that that intention can be sustained, we are called to turn to this idea of balance. So as we've spoken about, Shanti is both a state of place as well as a state of mind. And the great paradox, perhaps, is that while we are constantly tempted to address Shanti on the level of place, that is, on the level of our external surroundings and situation, circumstances, we actually have very little, we might even say little to no control over that. But what is so largely within our control is cultivating peace, cultivating Shanti, cultivating that state of mind. That is so largely within our control, even in the most trying of circumstances. And one of the reasons we brought this program together was particularly in light of the situation that's so outside of our control around the COVID-19 pandemic, and now experiencing perhaps so much anxiety, so much sadness, sorrow, anger, frustration about forces of division and hatred and prejudice in our country and in the world. So all of these things are such trying circumstances and such humbling reminders that there's so much outside of our control. And yet, even amidst these circumstances, what is within our control is cultivating this state of mind. And perhaps we get glimpses of it. I know for myself, I've gotten glimpses of it where at certain times there's this powerful realization of, even amidst the storm, I can be held and hold myself in a state of calm, in a state of Shanti, in a state of equanimity. The problem, or one problem though, is that those glimpses can be fleeting. So how to sustain them, how to create or cultivate or deepen a sustained practice. And here we turn again to the Bhagavad Gita. So many wonderful lessons in this text. And to the 6th chapter of the Gita, where in 2 verses, in 2 shlokas, Krishna speaks so powerfully and so practically around the idea of balance and moderation. He reminds us, and he reminds Arjuna, he says, "Oh Arjuna, one cannot be a yogi if one eats too much or eats too little." Another way of translating this is one who eats too much or one who fasts too much. One who sleeps too much or one who does not sleep enough, or another way of translating it is one who stays awake too much, one who stays in a state of vigil wakefulness too much. One, he says, who is balanced in their eating and movement, in their sleep and their wakefulness, in their endeavors and their work and their responsibility, such a person, Krishna says, such a person's sorrows are destroyed. Dukkha ha, the destruction of dukkha, of sorrow. How? Yoga, through yoga. So this is Krishna's very practical definition of how to have a sustained yoga practice, right? It won't work if we go to either extreme. If we're indulging in eating, right, or we can broaden this out to mean taking in. Eating is not just a physical act, but even mentally, what we eat, what we ingest, what we take in. If we're not discriminatory, if we're not discerning, and we just kind of ingest and take in without any limitation, there's no possibility of a sustained yoga practice. It just won't happen. We'll get knocked off balance. By the same token, or the flip side of the coin, is if we also go to the opposite extreme of of cutting everything off, of depriving that which we take in, of this kind of extreme fasting is very healthy, but it can quickly become a kind of an unhealthy pendulum swinging the other way, an extreme where we're kind of depriving ourselves of that which we need to nourish physical, emotional, and ultimately spiritual health. There's a beautiful story of Gautama Buddha, the enlightened one, the Buddha, who early in his process, his journey, who engaged in extreme penance and extreme fasting, and it's described in some texts that practically he became a walking skeleton. His skeletal frame could be seen. That's how much he had fasted and deprived his body of food and drink. And he was not feeling very satisfied or spiritually uplifted by this process. And according to the story, he overheard some village women singing a song, and the song was this song in the local language that was saying that a stringed instrument, to play a stringed instrument properly, the string can't be too loose because then it won't produce any sound, but it can't be too tight because then the instrument will break. And the Buddha was so overcome by this thought, he thought this is the essence of wisdom here, that the string should not be too tight or too slack. It should be in that state of balance. So let's take a deeper look at the state of balance. There's 2 words that I'd like to look at in Sanskrit for balance, and we'll just touch on this briefly. The first is a word that is a very common word for balance. That is, the word is Santulan or Tula. Tula literally is a scale. So a balance in the noun form of being a scale is called a Tula or Tulan. And this is often explained in terms of being a stationary balance. So often when we think of balance, we think of this image that you see on the screen of scales that weigh and that are meant to come to this point where you have exactly equal weight on each side. And so the scale finds that place of perfect balance, Santulan. So Santulan is equal or proportionate elements, right? When you have the equal amount on each side, or the equal weight, we can say, not exactly amount, but the equal weight on each side, that is in one sense a state of stationary balance. And in this idea of stationary balance, our steadiness, our ability to be fixed, comes from being deeply rooted in a center of gravity. So the way a scale works, right, is it has to have that center point that allows, when you have the equal weight on each side, that allows this scale to come to a place of balance. So this is a beautiful idea, and we find this in yoga practice. There are many asanas. There's what's called tulasana, or the asana of balance. So this is very much in this idea of finding that steadiness by being rooted in a center of gravity, right? Even physically, making sure that there's symmetry so that there is kind of equal weight distributed on each side. That's a beautiful idea, and often in our lives we need to do that. We need to, as we saw with these Gita verses, we need to make sure that what is going on the right side, we're kind of balancing that out with what's going on the left side, right? Um, as beautiful as this idea is, though, it's only one part of the picture, because the danger when our picture of balance is only in this way, in this paradigm of stationary balance, is we can sometimes think that as long as I have equal quantities of things, I can just offset, right? So let me give you a kind of an extreme example of this. If I, let's say that I am struggling because I feel like I have too much of a kind of a dependence on coffee. If I've become too habituated, perhaps even addicted to coffee, I may decide that instead of drinking coffee every day, I'm going to drink coffee every other day. So I'm going to balance out my coffee drinking with my non-coffee drinking. So this is kind of a Santulan approach to balance, right? Um, Maybe I'll have, right, 3 days of coffee, 3 days of no coffee, and 1 day of half a cup of coffee. And I just find that perfect mathematical balance. So that may work for some of us in some circumstances. But now, and I'm intentionally giving an extreme example, imagine you have someone who's struggling with a deeper addiction. Let's say someone is struggling with addiction to alcohol. For them, simply saying, okay, well, I'll drink alcohol 3 days of the week and I won't drink 3 days of the week, that may not work. In fact, that is likely not to work. That's likely not um, effective at addressing the root cause of that addiction. And again, I'm speaking very in general terms. I'm not trying to make light of the real kind of disease of addiction. But all this to say, in that case, what appears to be balance isn't really a balanced perspective. It's not what's going to get at a sustained healthy state. And so we have to look at a different definition of balance. And this definition is often paired to the word yukta, which we find Krishna repeats throughout these two verses, and especially the second verse, chapter 6, verse 17, where Krishna repeatedly uses this word yukta. And yukta we can understand as kind of an analog for the idea of dynamic balance. Here we're talking about balance as an equilibrium, as a flow state. And the simplest way of understanding this is most of us, I would imagine, have this experience where we know how to ride a bicycle, right? There was a time where perhaps we didn't know how to ride a bicycle as young children, or maybe not so young children, and we had to learn. And when we learned, what we were essentially learned was we learned a state of dynamic balance. It wasn't like the scale where you found the perfect mathematical weight and then just let it rest. It was instead a kind of a steadiness that came from constant movement, learning how to go constantly move towards the right and then towards the left, towards the right and towards the left, and going back and forth. And then as we learn to ride our bike, perhaps with more ease and with more smoothness, we learned how sometimes it wasn't just a matter of the perfect mathematical balance of turns between right and left. It was knowing when to shift our weight one way or the other to compensate for whatever was going on circumstantially, right? To make the bike and to make ourselves move in the way that we needed and wanted to move, right? This is how we learn not only how to ride the bike, but how to turn and maybe even take sharp turns on the bike, right? So this idea of yukta is dynamic balance. It's steadiness that comes from constant movement back and forth, constant flowing and flows and ebbs going in and out, right? There's this idea of it's dynamic, it's active. We experience this state of dynamic balance or yukta and this is one of the reasons why yukta is translated in a couple of different ways. So yukta is translated as balance, but it's also translated as engagement. So we find the word yukta used often in texts like the Gita or the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali or the Upanishads as a synonym for engagement or being engaged. Why? Because again, there's that state of dynamic momentum. We won't achieve balance unless we're in that kind of that constant state of momentum. Once we lose that, just like with riding a bike again, once you slow down or you stop moving, you can't do it anymore, right? Or it's incredibly difficult. One of the hardest things is when you're riding a bicycle or a motorcycle and you don't have enough speed or momentum to balance. It's almost like, it takes so much effort and you may actually even fall. So it requires a certain kind of dynamic momentum. This idea of engagement. It requires, and another way yukta is defined is a state of alignment. It requires us to constantly be aligning ourselves. And this is where discernment and regulation comes in. So another way yukta is spoken about in the Gita is yukta is also regulation. Because what are we doing when we're regulating ourselves or regulating our actions, our thoughts, our state of being? Is we're tapping into that state of discernment to recognize in this situation what is called for. In this situation, how much do I need to lean forward? How much do I need to step back? And we talked about this in some of our previous sessions. And finally, and perhaps on the deepest level, yukta is translated as connection. In fact, yukta is a cognate for and is related even in terms of the root to the word yoga itself, because they both have this root of yuj, which is also a cognate for the English word yoke, connecting, dovetailing, linking, right? When yukta is that state of being connected to our higher purpose, and perhaps in a more devotional sense, to our higher source, to that divinity that is flowing within us and that is also sustaining us, right? So yukta or balance is also found in connecting to that higher source. Just like if we are tottering, sometimes we may feel like, like we have this illustration of this person who's trying to walk. So we need something to like hold on to. So yukta is also this inner state of knowing how to tap into and how to hold on to that which restores the balance to us. So an invitation to perhaps take this idea of balance. Most of us, I think, when we think of balance, we think more of that scale analogy than we do perhaps of the bicycle analogy. Perhaps this is an opportunity to reflect. So as a little bit of homework, maybe just to ask how we can deepen this idea of dynamic balance, this idea of yukta, by inquiring, what am I engaging with? Where is my engagement? Am I engaged? Is my spiritual and meditative and kind of thoughtful life one of divine or one of excuse me, dynamic momentum? So what am I engaging with, and how am I engaging with it? How am I aligned with what really matters in my life? And then asking, where are my deeper connections? So with that, I want to bring our formal presentation to a close. I can hang around for a little bit longer if folks have questions, comments, shares, reflections, anything that's on your mind or on your heart. I also understand some folks may need to leave. So if you do have to leave, thank you for joining us, and hope to see you next week for our final session before we go on break. But for those who can stay a little bit longer and would like to share, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question or share a comment or reflection. And I hope everyone can hear me okay. I didn't notice before, but there was I got a chat that there were some issues with the sound. So can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Very good.
Hi, Vineet. Soumya here.
Hi, Soumya.
Hi. Thank you so much for conducting this session. I especially appreciated. I was reflecting on it while you were talking about Yukta and balance, and just wanted to highlight that I especially appreciated you mentioning how hard it is, and that it takes practice, and that it has various components. Because many a times when we're shooting for it, it sort of feels like a one-for-one equation where you're like, if I'm trying, I should be able to achieve it. But given that there are so many factors, and especially when we're meditating, also you're helping us bring back ourselves if our mind wanders off. So just wanted to flag that to say that it's super helpful to be reminded that it's an ongoing process, and that it is particularly hard, and that it can be difficult at times.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for that reminder. Actually, I tried to convey that, but yeah, I can't be kind of stressed enough, I think. Um, and especially around this idea of, I think our minds, we're often tempted to think of things as kind of all or nothing, or as you said, like a one for one. And I know that I found it really, I've found that to be quite um, unproductive and quite daunting even. And what's been most helpful to me is just being able to break down things and say, okay, well, how can I approach this, and how can I keep coming back to it even when, or especially when I feel like, okay, I'm falling off, or I'm faltering, or you know, kind of wandering a little bit. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there's I received a question on uh, the chat, and someone is asking, in a yoga balancing pose, how might we channel this concept of Santulan or even Yukta? And I was going to reading my mind. The person asking the question um, says, other than with drishti, because one of the ways I was going to answer was actually drishti is really helpful in that, when we have that focus point that helps us. But I'm wondering, we have some yogis on the call here. I'm wondering if someone has any thoughts on this in the physical asana. Um, how do we channel this idea of balance?
I'd like to jump in if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So it's such a great question, because when I started doing yoga, it would feel very hard, especially when, like, in the tree pose, often the yoga teacher would suggest that, like, one, you try focusing your drishti on a particular point, and then to make it harder, you close your eyes and try to center within, and that is particularly hard. But on the external front, the awareness of where your limbs really are helps physically channel that balance, because we often feel that we're aligned, but we're really not, because we're not being so mindful on a daily basis about where our arms are going. And I think in a Hindu life session you recently had a guest who also encouraged us in a meditation session to close our eyes and ask ourselves, where is your hand, where is your leg? So you don't really have to see, you have an idea, to just remind myself of where my physical body is, to balance myself and recenter.
To non-moving, stationary object to fix our gaze on, but in a deeper sense, Somya, as you're recommending, it's also a kind of a focus as more of a kind of an awareness, even if it's not the physical act.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That was also such a great question, and like you obviously summarized it much more coherently than I
Oh,
would.
thank you. Um,
If I can add to that, Vinny.
yes, Malta, please.
Angela always has this nice phrase of if you fall out of the pose, notice where your mind went. So it's not necessarily like too much about the pose and holding the balance in the pose, but like becoming aware that once we fall out of balance in the pose, that's because in the mind we were drifting like towards certain things, and so realizing that this like unbalanced state, where that comes from, and yeah, just being aware like where the mind went is also.
Yeah, great insight. Yeah, absolutely. I think something that might be a little bit related to that is also thinking again about this kind of analogy of riding the bike, right? When, in one sense, when you're balancing on the bike, it's not like a mental exercise of thinking. It's a kind of a being present to that. And in fact, especially when, let's say, you're newer to riding a bike or younger, sometimes you can actually undo yourself. So I'm going to answer kind of by the, in the negative. Um, you can kind of undo yourself by getting too much in your head and thinking, okay, I'm balancing now. I have to balance now. I have to balance now. Right. So I wonder how that may also apply to asana practice, to meditation practice, where, part of the sort of the challenge for us may be kind of getting out of our heads. It's almost like you don't want to be in a state of thinking like, I'm balancing now, I'm balancing now, I'm balancing now, and to be so present, to allow the mind to be so present that that we're doing it rather than thinking it. Again, not always easy, and that's why with grace and with kindness we allow ourselves, we recognize we fall off, our mind wanders, we break the pose or we fall out of the pose, we just get back to it, we bring it back. Well, friends, thank you so much for joining us for another session. And as I said earlier, last week will be our final session for June, and then we'll go on a break for July, and we will return at the beginning of August. So join us next week for our last session before break, and then I hope you can join us in resuming in August. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week. And I hope to see you next week, if not sooner. Thanks so much.